Welcome back. And it's not just a crucial moment for Nigeria's electoral body, the Independent National Electoral Commission, but also a crucial time for Nigeria as we approach the next general election. In fact, the next set of off-cycle elections. Some would say it's the end of an era for INEC following the exit of Professor Mahmoud Yakubu after 10 years in the saddle. So what next? Joining us to have this conversation is one who should know and one who is passionate about electoral matters. He's the Executive Director of Yaga Africa. Mr. Samson Itodo joins us here in our Abuja studio. Welcome, Mr. Itodo.
Thanks for having me.
I've been seeing a lot of Lagos studio for Abuja.
It's good to see you in Abuja.
Yes, it's good to see you too.
Thanks for having me.
It's apt to ask what you believe to be the greatest legacy of Professor Mahmoud Yakubu, having worked closely with him, from a distance at Yaga Africa.
I think one of the greatest legacies that Mahmoud leaves behind is the automation of our electoral processes, especially the introduction of technology. Quite frankly, the BVAS and the IREV were conceptually a game changer for our electoral process. Now, I dare say that when you look across elections in different parts of Africa and also other parts of the world, our sophistication in the use of technology for our electoral process is quite advanced. So the BVAS is one legacy because, yes, there are challenges with the BVAS, but to a large extent, it has deepened the integrity of the accreditation process. It was an improvement, yes, on the smart card reader. The IREV, for the first time, we had the opportunity, even though it was consolidating on a process that Professor Jega started, but it was the first time that you had an online platform where citizens could, access the results. So that's one legacy. Yes, the politicians have tried to make a mess, of these technologies, but if we retain this technology, block some of those loopholes, it will limit human interference in our electoral process. I think the other thing, you say are part of the legacies that Professor Mahmoud leaves behind is the sort of reforms introduced in the management of elections. Some are not known to the public. The security features introduced on things like ballot papers, on the result sheets, they were not known to the public, but for those of us who work in elections, we also see and we observed how those processes were implemented. You can talk about inclusion. INEC was very vocal in advancing inclusion of persons living with disability, women and youth. So there's just so much. 10 years in the life of an institution is indeed a long time. But there are, several setbacks. You can look at where's the level of trust today in the electoral process. You also look at how other actors interfered, with the functions of INEC. And that also deepened, sort of the lack of integrity of the electoral process. The whole point about, the back end of the BVAS, the back end of the IREF, subjecting that, to public scrutiny. Yes, if you look at, things like online pre-registration was introduced by Mahmoud. Yes, there's to a large extent, improvement in the voters register, but there are lots of gaps that needs to be blocked. But I think that it's a mixed bag. But you cannot wish away that Professor Mahmoud introduced remarkable reforms. We are yet, as a country, to maximize the utility and the potential of those reforms because of the actors of our politicians. But I think that one thing that Professor Mahmoud leaves behind, to a large extent, is a weak INEC. And weak to the extent that there is a lot of political interference with the functions of INEC. A classic example is the appointment of partisan recs. And the chairman is not the appointing authority. But under the Professor Mahmoud, we saw how 3 resident electoral commissioners were removed from office because of either things like insubordination, lack of competence, but also manipulating the electoral process. But we have a weak INEC today, weak because of political interference, but also this same INEC was starved of resources to manage elections. As we speak, INEC has not gotten all the money for the 2023 elections. And we've said this repeatedly. that the by-elections that held in August should have held last year. Why? It couldn't, because the commission was not given the funding that it requires for elections. So when you look at elections broadly, you need to look at the interplay of other actors in the electoral process.
Does the interference that you talk about, either it's human interference at the institution itself or external from politicians, do they trump the positives by which we can assess? Do they trump the positives by which we can assess Professor Mahmood Yakubu?
Well, like I said, it's a mixed bag, and you have to do a balancing act, because when you look at some of the reforms, those were reforms that Nigeria required. So you give it to him that he led those reforms. We needed those reforms and even much more. But the question about reforms, and I'll say three things. One, that did the commission assert its independence in the way that it should to protect those reforms? I would say it did partly, but there are certain places that there were missed opportunities. The first one was, when you look at the voters' register, prior to the last elections, there were cases, where there was padding of the voters' register. There were illegal people who were on the voters' register, and those those who were responsible were some INEC officials. INEC constituted a panel to sanction those people. The public, as at today, is not aware of what kind of disciplinary actions were taken against those INEC officials. That's one. But if you put it against the resident electoral commissioners, you see that on one hand, yes, there were sanctions, but on the other hand, we as the public were not aware of some of those actions that were taken. The second point is this whole inconsistency, in the application of INEC's guidelines in certain instances, especially as it relates to collation of results. Yes, to a large extent, there's nothing the Electoral Commission and the leadership can do, because the law is very clear that once a returning officer has made a declaration, it's final. But by virtue of Section 64 of the Electoral Act, INEC can review. The question is, how often did INEC activate that power of review? Did INEC issue a set of guidelines prior to a few months ago when INEC issued those guidelines? There were gaps, but we saw how the commission responded to it. So it's really a mixed bag. But I think at the heart of this is when you go to the street and ask Nigerians, do they believe that their votes count in today's Nigeria? Is the level of trust as high as it was prior to the 2023 election? The answer is a capital no, right? And there are several data sets that establish it. This is why we are now at a critical moment of rebuilding trust in the electoral process. And how and who becomes the next INEC chairman and the other national commissioners will determine the sort of, credibility and legitimacy of the next elections. But yes, Professor Mahmood has served his country. We congratulate him on his tenure. The reforms that he's introduced, I believe strongly in some of those reforms. Those reforms need to be protected, but there are certain gaps and missed opportunities, and there are bigger lessons that we need to learn if we're really interested in the legitimacy of our electoral processes.
And just before we get to Lagos, reforms are critical to results. So yes, we're celebrating the results, but ultimately, when you consider the application of the reforms to electoral conduct itself, how would you assess INEC under his watch when you consider the 2015 elections to 2019 elections, 2023 elections?
I think, again, it's a mixed bag. You have to do a balancing act. Because one, under Professor Mahmood, it was the first time in the history of Nigeria, and maybe Nigerians don't know this, that we as a country printed our ballot papers and result sheets in Nigeria. In other words, local production of electoral materials happened under Professor Mahmood. Since I would say 1999, all our ballot papers and result sheets for general elections were printed outside Nigeria. That was what accounted for the postponement of elections in 2011, the logistical challenges that we encountered. So you see that, yes, somehow there's an improvement, of election, but you cannot wish away the conduct of the other political actors, especially security agencies, as well as our politicians, and how they continue to assault on the independence, of INEC. For instance, when we talked about Adamawa the last time, you saw how the REC, behaved. One of the RECs from Sokoto, the former RECs, is being prosecuted for corruption and bribery. And this is why INEC under Professor Mahmood was also advocating that the power to appoint resident electoral commissioners should not be vested in the president. It should be vested in INEC. The same way the power to appoint commissioners of police in the police force isn't vested in the president, it's vested in the IG of police. So it's really, a mixed bag. Again, I would say that, yes, to a large extent, some of the things we experienced was that the higher INEC improved on its technical competence, the greater the political interference with the commission. And the question is, did the commission resist that political interference? There were cases it did, there were cases it dropped the ball.
So much to reflect on and so much to unpack there, but I'm sure Kayode has follow-up questions for you, particularly as they have to do with the appointment of the next INEC chairman. Kayode, over to you, or chairwoman.
Well, and that's where we're headed to, really. We see two options before us, more than two options, actually. But let me just try to restrict it to two possibilities: internal recruitment or external recruitment. That's how I choose to see this. But there's a breakdown of the options in-house and just how much time they have left before their tenure expires. That's for the national commissioners. So if it's not going to be internal, I don't know what it will be for you, either internal or external, but maybe look at the options internally and externally as well. Are we looking at yet another professor? Someone made a joke recently and said, are we looking at Samson Itodo as a possible INEC chair?
Definitely not me, because I'm not qualified. But I'm not yet qualified.
So speak to us about what you're permutating and combining as it is.
Well, I don't know if it'll be a professor. Well, as you know, the Council of State is meeting tomorrow. Yeah. We hope that one of the issues will be a consideration of a nominee from the president, because the Council of State is required by virtue of Section 154 of the Constitution to advise the president. So we don't know what will come out of that, but we expect that it will accelerate this process in view of the fact that we have the Anambra elections. But you did put up a slide earlier. Yes, the INEC chairman has gone, but there are 9 other national commissioners that would leave before the 2027 elections. So if those who are, qualified for reappointment are not reappointed, in 2027, we would have a relatively new INEC leadership. So when you look at the screen, you look at next year, 4 national commissioners would leave because their term will have come to an end. But those 4 national commissioners are qualified for reappointment because this is just their first term. When you look at 2027, exactly 22nd of February, because the next election would hold on the 20th of February. Again, if you want to commend Professor Mahmood, it was under his administration that they ensured the regularity of election timetables. So we can tell the dates of the next general elections in 2031 up till about 2063 or so, and thanks to the Mahmood administration. So in 2027, 5 other national commissioners will exit INEC. So there are 9 national commissioners. 2 of them, Mrs. May Agbamuche, who is the current acting chair, and National Commissioner Mohammed Haruna, are serving their second term, so they would not be qualified or eligible for reappointment. So you're going to have 7 national commissioners actually leave. And so it's really critical as we go into this appointment process. But the bigger question is, what is the qualification? What kind of INEC chairman are Nigerians seeking for? And there are 5 things that Nigerians have said. The first one is, yes, the Constitution says you have to be non-partisan. But it's not just being non-partisan. It's that you shouldn't have been a member of a political party, whether in the past or presently. That's one. The second is you need individuals of impeccable, character. You need individuals who can resist political pressure. You need individuals, who have experience, whether it's in election or in a related field. And Kaide, you said a professor. I don't think that professors have monopoly of managing elections, but it looks like it's been a trend, so we wouldn't be surprised if we see another professor, but also someone who has that mental alertness and that ability, because managing election is such a complex enterprise. And we hope that the president will be guided by this as he begins the process of appointing the next chair. But Professor Mahmoud's exit is perhaps the first major activity in the entire timeline of the leadership transition that INEC is experiencing.
And some would say that it's not an accident that Mrs. May Agbamuche Umbo is one, acting right now, although, her tenure expires in 2027. But is it a signal to the Council of State that perhaps we should consider a chairwoman as the next INEC boss?
Yeah, May Agbamuche will not be the first female acting chair. Former Commissioner Hajia Amina Zakari was in acting capacity before Professor Mahmoud assumed office. So it won't be, the first time. There are two of them who are the most senior, but she was picked. I think that all of this needs to be situated within the broader conversation around women leadership. And that when people think that elections are just, are too complex and too technical for women, it's not the truth. One of the finest electoral commissioners you have, whether in Nigeria or across Africa, are women. We've seen female chairs of electoral commissions in South Africa, in Cape Verde. In fact, in Ghana, the current chair, Madam Jean Mensah, is a female. So there are female chairs of electoral commission. So I don't know why Nigeria should be different. You have qualified women who can be chairs, of the electoral commission. But I think it's disappointing, and perhaps we should be ashamed of ourselves as a country that in the history of the electoral commission there hasn't been any substantive female chair of the electoral commission. So it's the president's prerogative. He has an opportunity. Can we, as part of his own legacy, also consider a female chair of the Electoral Commission? And he will be making history. But again, it's his prerogative, and we look forward to who becomes the nominee and how the Senate will manage this process. Because it's not just the president. How the Senate manages the process of the confirmation process is really critical. And this whole point about taking the bow cannot happen with the INEC chair. I listened to your comments this morning about the former Minister of Science and Technology and how he was asked to take a bow. If the Senate scrutinized, his credentials, maybe they would have actually spotted this. And so we are calling on the Senate. In fact, today, civil society will be sending official letters to the 109 senators across the Senate with the framework for citizens' engagement. Once the nomination is read on the floor, National Assembly should publish, the criteria. They should publish the credentials of the nominee and invite the public within a certain timeline to submit memorandum and petitions against any nominee, and they should consider those memorandum and petitions on their merit. When you make this process, citizens-led, citizens-driven, and transparent, you boost confidence on the part of Nigerians, especially Nigerians who are thinking that they are not going to show up to vote at the next election because their vote will not count. So, how the Senate manages this process, the due diligence that it performs, would really show to Nigerians if they are committed to an independent, inclusive, accountable, and transparent INEC.
And that's critical.
Very
Speaking
critical.
of what else that is critical would be the next INEC chairman. You've talked to us about the criteria that Nigerians are looking for: non-partisan, a man of integrity, who would not crumble beneath the weight of political pressure. Perhaps, the decision has already been made, and we're just waiting for the process of scrutiny with the Council of State, and with the Senate. Some Nigerians may have already made up their minds that whoever is coming is going to be as always, at the whims and caprices of the appointee, of the appointer, in this case, the president. What can civil society do differently this time to ensure that the process is transparent and it goes the way of popular will?
So civil society have been working on the new INEC campaign, which Yaga Africa is a part of. And we've been having lots of advocacy and discussions around this. Now, there are sort of three different stakeholders involved in the appointment process. The first is the president. He has the power by virtue of the Constitution. He's the appointing authority. But the Constitution says the Council of State would need to advise him. The president is not compelled by the Constitution to adopt or take the advice of the Council of State. It's just advisory. But we believe that the Council of State would advise the president, in line and in a public interest. And then afterwards, it goes to the Senate. Today, the members of the Council of State would receive official letters, from civil society, calling on them to draw the attention of the president when they advise him to this criteria that has been set by citizens, but also urge the president to be a statesman and live above board in appointing the next INEC chairman. And it should be one who does not have any partisan connections, because it would inspire the trust and confidence of Nigerians, and one that has the capacity and ability to resist political pressure and those criteria. But secondly, is to also ask that when the Senate begins its consideration, this confirmation process is not one where you ask a nominee to come take a bow, because INEC is a critical institution for our democracy. You have to scrutinize that particular individual. There are specific questions that you need to ask those individuals. But like I mentioned earlier, civil society have been keeping watch over this process. You know what happened during one of the appointment process? When the former President Buhari appointed some commissioners, civil society submitted petitions against some of the nominees because of their reputation and their background, national commissioners. When the petitions were submitted, the Senate declined considering the petitions on the basis that those petitions were not accompanied by an affidavit. There's no way civil society would have known, because it's not written in any book or any guidelines that you needed to accompany your petition or memo with an affidavit. They just sprung a surprise, on civil society. That's not something that should happen under the 10th Senate. I listened to the Senate president yesterday, who said that as a Senate, they'll be accountable to Nigerians. The first test for this Senate yesterday is this appointment confirmation process. The way they make it open, live, and ask people to participate in the hearing would really inspire public trust and have a unique opportunity. And I want to give them the benefit of doubt that they would seize it in the best interest of our democracy.
And what you have said is quite apt about this being a collective responsibility. So all Nigerians must, take on that challenge. That's to be at alert. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Samson Etodo, for your time on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Etodo is the Executive Director of Yaga Africa. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.